The sun was just rising over Fort Bragg, casting long shadows across the neatly trimmed parade grounds. Rows of soldiers stood at rigid attention, their polished boots clicking against the concrete as they shifted slightly to ease the stiffness of the morning chill. The air smelled faintly of dew, dust, and the ever-present tang of machinery from the nearby motor pool. For the hundreds gathered, this was another routine day of training exercises, a mix of drills, inspections, and physical endurance tests, but none of them expected what would happen next. From the edge of the field, a lone figure appeared. She walked with a calm, measured stride, her posture perfect, the folds of her fatigues immaculate despite the early hour. At first, soldiers assumed she was a civilian, or perhaps a visiting journalist. There had been odd, last-minute additions to the roster before dawn, though nothing official had been announced. The woman's presence immediately drew attention, cutting through the murmurs and the morning haze. "Who is she?" whispered a private to his neighbor, his voice barely audible. "Some mistake?" another replied, scanning her face. "Probably a civilian contractor." Her gaze moved steadily across the rows of soldiers. She didn't flinch at the stairs, didn't shift nervously, didn't adjust her gear. There was something in the way she held herself controlled, precise, that made even the more experienced soldiers pause. It wasn't arrogance. It wasn't a challenge. It was confidence. Pure, quiet, undeniable confidence. Lieutenant Ramirez, standing near the center of the formation, frowned. "She shouldn't be here," he muttered under his breath. He wasn't one to jump to conclusions, but military protocol was clear. Anyone on the field needed clearance. This woman had none of the usual identification or paperwork visible, and yet there was an aura about her that made Ramirez hesitate. He knew the difference between someone merely pretending and someone trained to an exceptional level, and even at a glance, this woman radiated competence. Private soldiers began nudging each other, eyes darting back and forth, whispers rising in volume. Rumors spread quickly. Half of them were exaggerated guesses, the other half outright fabrications. Some said she was a journalist. Others whispered about a special forces trial. A few even dared to joke, questioning her gender, as if that alone would determine her legitimacy. None of them realized they were watching someone entirely outside their normal understanding of military hierarchy. Sergeant McAllister, a veteran of 20 years with a reputation for discipline and strict control, noticed the unusual gathering of glances. His face tightened into a hard line as he marched toward the edge of the formation, the gravel crunching sharply under his boots. Soldiers instinctively straightened even further, sensing the approach of someone accustomed to authority. He stopped a few feet from the woman, towering over her with an air of skepticism that could silence a room. "Who are you, and what are you doing here?" he demanded, his voice echoing across the field. The drill sergeant's eyes narrowed, scanning her from head to toe, as if trying to detect the tiniest sign of falsehood. The woman didn't flinch. She met his gaze evenly, without hesitation. "I'm a Navy SEAL," she said, her voice calm, precise, and carrying enough authority to make the surrounding soldiers stop and listen. A ripple of laughter ran through the formation. 500 soldiers, many with deployments and combat experience, found themselves simultaneously incredulous and intrigued. Laughter, whispered disbelief, and murmurs spread across the ranks like wildfire. Sergeant McAllister's jaw tightened. The audacity of this claim, coming from a lone woman no one had seen before, was almost insulting to his sense of order. In his eyes, a Navy SEAL should be legendary, known, impossible to mistake. And yet here she stood, calm, composed, utterly unafraid, as though the laughter didn't exist. She didn't laugh. She didn't defend herself. She simply stood, scanning the field with eyes that missed nothing, as if already assessing the hundreds of soldiers around her, their stance, their readiness, their reactions. There was no panic, no arrogance. Just a presence so commanding that, in an instant, the soldiers knew she was someone extraordinary, even if none of them could yet understand why. And in that moment, the atmosphere shifted. What had begun as a routine morning drill was no longer ordinary. The air was charged with anticipation, tension, and an unspoken question hanging over everyone present. Who was this woman, and what would happen next? Sergeant Michael Lester's eyes narrowed, the early morning sun glinting off his polished badge as he stepped closer to the lone figure on the parade ground. Every movement was deliberate, authoritative years of training and command experience distilled into a single imposing presence. Around him, the formation of 500 soldiers stiffened, sensing the tension that had suddenly taken over the field. The murmurs had stopped. All eyes were on the two figures now standing just yards apart. Name, rank, why are you here? Michael Lester's voice cut through the morning air like a knife. It wasn't a question, it was a challenge, a gauntlet thrown down. Every syllable carried weight, intended to unsettle, to assert control. He expected hesitation, uncertainty, maybe even fear. The woman's gaze did not waver. She stood perfectly still, her posture relaxed, but unmistakably alert. "I'm a Navy SEAL," she said calmly, her voice carrying across the field. No pride, no defiance, just the statement of fact, delivered with the kind of precision only someone trained to absolute clarity could muster. For a heartbeat, the field was silent. Then came the laughter, low at first, almost incredulous, then growing louder as the soldiers around them realized what had just been said. Half of them snorted, thinking it a joke. The other half shook their heads, convinced someone was playing a prank. A Navy SEAL? McAllister's face twisted in disbelief, his brows knitting together. Here? On my field? You've got to be kidding me. He turned toward the formation, raising his voice to let everyone hear. You all heard that. She claims she's a Navy SEAL. Let's see if she even belongs here. The soldiers shifted uneasily. Many had heard rumors of SEALs, of their legendary skill and extreme training. But most had never seen one in person, let alone a woman standing alone, claiming to be one. Whispers began to spread again, this time tinged with a mix of awe and skepticism. McAllister stepped forward, his boots crunching against the gravel. He circled her like a predator, hands on his hips. You've got papers? Orders? Proof? His tone was sharp, commanding, meant to provoke. The woman reached into her pocket and produced a small badge standard military ID. He grabbed it, inspected it quickly, then tossed it aside, unconvinced. This doesn't prove anything, he said, eyes burning into hers. I've seen men with fake credentials try this before. You think you can walk onto my field, claim a title, and command respect? Not on my watch. She didn't answer. Instead, she let her silence speak. Her calm defiance only made McAllister more agitated. He could feel the eyes of his soldiers on him, waiting for a spectacle. He had been the authority here for decades, a man whose word meant law on this parade ground. And yet, here stood someone who refused to cower. You're going to prove it, he said finally, his voice lower now, dangerous. One drill, one demonstration. Let's see if you're really as good as you claim. His smirk was faint, barely noticeable, but it carried the certainty that she would fail. He expected hesitation, fumbling, perhaps even a collapse under pressure. Instead, she nodded once, simply. No fear, no argument, just readiness. The crowd held its collective breath. Even the most seasoned soldiers realized that this was no ordinary confrontation. Something about her composure, her calm assessment of the situation, made them pause. She was already reading the field, calculating every angle, anticipating every move, not in arrogance, but as a professional who had been trained for the unimaginable. McAllister's jaw clenched. He had underestimated her in that split second, and that alone made him angry. The field was quiet now, the laughter gone, replaced by an electric tension. 500 soldiers watched, realizing they were about to witness something extraordinary, or, at least, something none of them would forget. And in that silence, the air seemed to thicken. Every eye was on her, every thought holding its breath. What would she do next? Could she really be what she claimed? Or would the morning end in humiliation for the audacious intruder? The answer hung in the air like lightning before a storm waiting, inevitable and impossible to ignore. The morning air had thickened with tension. Sergeant McAllister's boots scraped sharply against the parade ground, echoing like a drumbeat over the hush of 500 soldiers. Every eye was fixed on the lone woman standing before him, unwavering, composed, utterly calm. Her simple statement, "I'm a Navy SEAL," had sent shockwaves through the formation. But it was his job to restore order, to assert authority, and to demonstrate that no one, no matter how bold, could walk onto his field unchallenged. "Step aside," McAllister barked, his voice booming across the ranks. "You don't belong here. You're disrupting this formation. Now move, or I'll have you escorted off immediately." The soldiers around them shifted uncomfortably. Some tried to suppress smirks, others exchanged doubtful glances, and a few whispered about the audacity of a woman standing toe-to-toe with one of the most feared sergeants on base. But she didn't flinch. She didn't hesitate. She simply stood, hands relaxed at her sides, eyes scanning the sergeant's every movement. "Disrupting?" she said, her voice calm, but carrying an unshakable authority. "I'm here to train. If you've got a problem with my presence, maybe you should step aside." The laughter from earlier was gone, replaced by a heavy silence. Soldiers who had mocked her seconds ago now found themselves wondering if they had underestimated her. But McAllister wasn't about to let a woman, any woman, defy him publicly. He stepped closer, towering over her, the muscles in his neck taut. His face was red with indignation, his eyes narrowing to dangerous slits. "You will move," he said sharply, each word punctuated by a stomp of his boot, "or I'll make sure the entire chain of command knows how disrespectful you are. I don't care if you're a SEAL or a general. You don't walk onto my parade ground unannounced and expect command attention. Do you understand me?" "I understand perfectly," she replied, her tone steady, unflinching. She didn't raise her voice, didn't sound defensive. Instead, she radiated confidence, a calm that spoke of someone who had faced situations far worse than this. "And I also understand that you don't get to underestimate someone because of their appearance. Let me prove it or step aside." The soldiers shifted uneasily, the formation holding its breath. Some were rooting for the sergeant, their instincts telling them he must maintain authority. Others were secretly intrigued by the woman's composure, feeling a mix of admiration and disbelief. Whispers rippled across the ranks, but no one dared speak too loudly. McAllister's face hardened. Pride and anger battled within him. To allow a public challenge would be unthinkable. To dismiss her without action would be humiliating. He wanted her gone, but he also wanted to assert dominance, to show that no one could challenge his authority, even if the audience of 500 soldiers expected spectacle. "Listen," he growled, leaning in slightly. "I don't care what you've done before. On my field, you follow my orders. Step aside, or I'll make you regret it." Her eyes locked onto his, unwavering. "Step aside from what? From your ego? From underestimating me? I didn't come here to prove myself to you. I came to do my job. And if you're unwilling to let me, then the consequences are yours." The soldiers froze. Even those accustomed to strict discipline felt the weight of the moment. Something about her calm, unwavering tone made it clear. She wasn't bluffing. And more importantly, she wasn't afraid. McAllister's jaw tightened, his pride wounded. He motioned toward the formation, signaling he had the authority to escalate, but hesitated. For the first time in decades, he was confronting someone who refused to submit. And that refusal, so quiet, so composed, was louder than any shout, any command, any display of rank. The field seemed to hold its breath, waiting for the inevitable. Would the sergeant enforce his authority with brute force? Or would the woman stand her ground and prove, in a way none of them could have anticipated, that skill and preparation outweighed intimidation? The tension was almost unbearable. Soldiers instinctively straightened, leaning forward, their eyes locked on the unfolding confrontation. It was no longer just a morning drill. It was a test of power, pride, and perception, and no one knew how it would end. In that frozen moment, it became clear to every soldier on the field. This was not going to be an ordinary day. And the woman standing before Sergeant McAllister had already claimed something more important than respect she had captured there. Undivided attention. The sun climbed higher, burning off the last of the morning haze, but the tension on the parade ground only thickened. Sergeant McAllister's face was a mask of disbelief and simmering rage. Every muscle in his body was taut, coiled like a spring, ready to assert dominance. Across the field, the woman remained perfectly still, her gaze calm, analytical, almost surgical. For 500 soldiers, this was no longer a simple morning drill. It had become a spectacle of power, pride, and precision. McAllister's jaw tightened. He had built a career on respect earned through authority, on obedience drilled into men who feared losing face under his command. And yet, here was someone, a lone figure, standing on his field and refusing to yield, refusing to even flinch. "Fine," he growled, his voice low but edged with menace. "If you're so confident, then prove it. One drill, one demonstration. Right here, right now. Show me that you're more than words." The soldiers exchanged nervous glances. Some cheered silently, curious to see the result, while others shifted uneasily, unsure how this would end. Many had trained under McAllister, known his reputation for toughness, and they could sense the rare crack in his usual iron composure. The woman, on the other hand, seemed unfazed, almost serene. She took a single deep breath, relaxed her shoulders, and nodded slightly. No hesitation, no fear. McAllister signaled for a safe demonstration area, keeping the formation at a careful distance. The soldiers quickly fell into an organized semicircle, holding their breath as the anticipation built. Whispers rippled through the ranks. "Do you think she can actually do it?" One whispered. She's a woman," another muttered, almost shamefully. Yet even as doubt lingered, there was a palpable undercurrent of awe. Something about her posture, her calm gaze, her unwavering presence, commanded attention. "Here's the deal," McAllister said, his voice sharper now. "One routine combat drill. One standard immobilization. That's it. Fail, and you leave this field immediately. No excuses." He expected a stumble, a hesitation, a crack in her armor. He didn't anticipate what was about to unfold. The woman glanced briefly at him, her eyes scanning every subtle movement, the way he shifted his weight, the tension in his shoulders, the way his eyes darted for advantage. She adjusted her stance, moving into a ready position, perfectly balanced, every muscle poised for controlled action. 500 soldiers watched, silent and tense, aware they were about to witness either humiliation or mastery. McAllister lunged first, testing her reflexes, expecting her to flinch, to react defensively in a sloppy, human way. But she wasn't human in the way he expected, not in the conventional sense. Her reaction was fluid, precise, almost instantaneous. One controlled maneuver, and the sergeant found himself losing balance, caught in a technique that he had seen only in specialized training videos, never in practice. The crowd gasped. Soldiers instinctively leaned forward, their eyes wide. Murmurs ran through the ranks. No way. She's actually doing it. That's impossible. I've never seen anyone move like that. McAllister stumbled, but recovered, his mind racing. He realized that this wasn't luck. This wasn't some fluke. This was professional, elite, trained perfection. His pride burned hotter than the morning sun. He could feel the eyes of the entire base on him, judging him, and yet he couldn't stop her. She wasn't aggressive. She wasn't reckless. She was controlled, deliberate, executing every movement with unmatched precision. Seconds stretched into eternity. The crowd held its breath. Soldiers exchanged glances, realizing that what they were witnessing was not a display of defiance. It was a demonstration of mastery. A Navy SEAL in action, right there in front of 500 witnesses, neutralizing not with rage, but with skill, efficiency, and absolute control. McAllister finally paused, breathing hard, awareness dawning. He had underestimated her. Every command, every expectation, every ounce of authority he carried meant nothing against someone with this level of training. And yet, the lesson was clear. Authority is temporary. Skill, preparation, and discipline endure. The woman stepped back, her stance relaxed, hands at her sides. Her eyes never left his, calm, unwavering, unthreatening, yet commanding respect. The soldiers watched in stunned silence, realizing that they had just witnessed something extraordinary, an unspoken lesson that would echo across the base long after the drill ended. The challenge was over, but the story had only begun. The field held its collective breath. The sun beat down, highlighting every bead of sweat, every tense muscle, every widening eye. Sergeant McAllister, seasoned, formidable, and unflappable for decades, suddenly felt a rare flicker of uncertainty. He had seen soldiers falter, recruits crumble, and even experienced officers falter under pressure, but none of them had moved like this woman. She wasn't reacting with fear or panic. She was anticipating, controlling, and calculating every microsecond of the encounter. McAllister lunged forward again, testing her reactions under pressure, his authority screaming for dominance. The crowd of 500 soldiers instinctively leaned in. This was no ordinary demonstration. They were witnessing a live test of skill against experience, nerve against discipline. The woman shifted her weight almost imperceptibly, just enough to adjust to his momentum. In one fluid, lightning-quick motion, she executed a professional maneuver that caught McAllister completely off guard. It wasn't reckless. It wasn't about hurting him, but it was undeniable. The sergeant stumbled, losing his footing, his powerful frame faltering under a technique designed for maximum control and minimal effort. Gasps spread across the formation. Soldiers instinctively whispered to each other, unable to process what they were seeing. "That's impossible," one muttered. "She's actually a SEAL," another said under his breath. The disbelief was palpable. This was not aggression. It was precision, the kind that separated elite operators from the rest of the military. McAllister, ever the competitor, tried to regain balance, his training kicking in to resist being overpowered. But the woman anticipated every movement, every reflexive shift. In a single, perfectly timed motion, she neutralized his stance completely. The sergeant's leg buckled under him, sending him down with a controlled fall, a sharp thud echoing across the parade ground. Silence followed. Absolute stunned silence. No one moved. 500 soldiers froze, their eyes wide. Some instinctively stepped back, others pressed their hands to their mouths, unable to look away. Even the most experienced officers felt a moment of disbelief, What had just happened defied their expectations of skill and authority. The woman didn't raise her voice. She didn't gloat. She simply stepped back, letting McAllister settle on the ground, her eyes scanning him calmly, as if to say, "This is not personal. This is precision. This is discipline." The contrast between her serene composure and his stunned astonishment was striking. Medics rushed forward, their urgency mingled with awe. McAllister grimaced, aware of the injury, but also painfully conscious of what had just occurred. He had been outmaneuvered in front of 500 soldiers. Pride burned hotter than the morning sun, and yet there was no denying the reality. She had moved with flawless technique, controlled force, and unshakable confidence. For the crowd, the lesson was instantaneous. This wasn't a fight. It wasn't about aggression or anger. It was mastery years of training condensed into a single decisive action. The soldiers who had laughed minutes ago now looked on in stunned respect. They realized that appearances were deceiving, and that true skill carried its own authority. McAllister, though in pain, finally lifted his head, his face a mixture of disbelief and grudging respect. He had underestimated her. And in that moment, the field understood something essential. Authority and intimidation could command attention, but skill, preparation, and discipline commanded respect. The woman stepped back fully, her stance relaxed, hands lightly resting at her sides. She was calm, controlled, and completely professional. There was no showmanship, no cruelty, just competence, executed perfectly under pressure. The soldiers watching understood that this was more than a demonstration. It was a lesson, and a lasting one at that. What had begun as a routine drill had transformed into a moment none of them would ever forget. A moment that blurred the lines between expectation and reality, between assumption and truth. And while McAllister processed what had just happened, the woman's presence lingered in the minds of every soldier on the field, a testament to what it meant to be elite, disciplined, and completely prepared for the unexpected. In that single, split-second turn, respect had been earned, pride had been challenged, and the entire formation witnessed history on their own parade ground. The morning sun shone brightly over the parade ground, but the warmth did nothing to ease the tension that hung thick in the air. Sergeant McAllister lay on the ground, one leg twisted unnaturally, breathing hard and grappling with a rare and deeply unwelcome sense of disbelief. Around him, 500 soldiers remained frozen, staring at the scene before them, each processing what had just occurred in slow motion. For a moment, it seemed as though the world itself had paused. Whispers had vanished. Laughter had disappeared. Even the birds in the surrounding trees seemed to fall silent, as if nature itself had acknowledged the magnitude of the moment. The woman, standing a few feet away, radiated calm. Her stance was relaxed, hands loosely at her sides, yet every fiber of her being was alert, observant, and fully in control. No one spoke. Soldiers instinctively stepped back, unsure whether to approach, cheer, or simply remain still. Their eyes were wide, reflecting awe, disbelief, and a hint of fear. They had not expected this. No one had. To see Sergeant McAllister, a man whose reputation for toughness was legendary, brought low by a single, calculated maneuver was unprecedented. Private Jenkins, a young recruit who had only been at the base for 6 months, whispered to his neighbor, barely audible, Did she just? That's impossible." His neighbor swallowed hard. I think she really is a SEAL," he murmured, disbelief still tinged with admiration. "I've never seen anyone move like that. Ever." The murmurs grew slowly, a low hum that spread like wildfire across the formation. Soldiers exchanged glances, nodding to one another, trying to make sense of the impossible reality. 500 men and women, trained to recognize skill and authority, now faced a truth they couldn't ignore. Appearances could deceive, and true mastery was unmistakable when displayed. McAllister finally began to move, groaning as he shifted onto his back and tested his leg. The pain was sharp, but more than physical, it carried the sting of pride wounded. For the first time in decades, he had been bested in front of his soldiers, not through luck, not through trickery, but by the sheer, undeniable skill of a professional who had trained for years in ways he had never anticipated. The woman approached cautiously, not aggressively, but to offer assistance if necessary. "You okay, Sergeant?" she asked calmly, her tone neither mocking nor superior. It was professional, measured, and commanding respect without demanding it. McAllister's face was a mixture of surprise and grudging acknowledgement. He nodded stiffly, unable to deny what had just happened. Yeah, I'm fine," he admitted, his voice tight. You didn't just claim it. You proved it." The soldiers around them were silent, absorbing the lesson in real time. This wasn't about humiliation. This wasn't about dominance. It was about expertise, preparation, and the undeniable truth that elite skill could not be ignored, even by those with years of authority and experience. For the recruits and seasoned soldiers alike, a quiet understanding settled over the formation. This was not merely a display of combat technique. It was a masterclass in discipline, control, and professionalism. No one had been reckless. No one had acted out of anger. Every motion had been deliberate, precise, and calculated. Medics arrived to assist McAllister, but even their professionalism could not mask the awe in their expressions. They had treated injuries countless times, yet none had been associated with a demonstration quite like this one that taught an unspoken lesson to an entire formation. As the woman stepped back and allowed the medics to help the sergeant, the soldiers realized something profound. Respect was earned not by rank or intimidation, but by skill, composure, and confidence. The lessons of this morning would resonate long after the drills ended, far beyond the walls of the base. Silence remained on the field, but it was no longer tense. It was reverent. Soldiers instinctively lowered their heads, not in shame, but in recognition of a standard few would ever reach a demonstration of mastery that transcended rank, gender, or expectation. The woman's presence lingered, commanding attention without effort. She hadn't shouted. She hadn't demanded acknowledgement. She had simply done what she was trained to do, and in doing so, she had transformed an ordinary morning drill into a moment of historic significance for everyone who had witnessed it. The soldiers would tell this story for years. They would retell it to new recruits, to visitors, and even among themselves during long nights on duty. Not as a tale of force, but as a lesson in professionalism, humility, and the power of preparation. And as the formation finally began to relax, McAllister sat up, his pride bruised, but his respect earned. The woman had not just bested him, she had shown every soldier present what it truly meant to be elite. The air on the parade ground was electric, thick with awe and disbelief. Sergeant McAllister, still seated and nursing his injured leg, stared at the woman who had just demonstrated the kind of skill he had only heard about in stories. 500 soldiers remained in formation, their faces a mix of admiration, shock, and something deeper, a growing understanding that they had witnessed something extraordinary. The moment had stretched long enough for whispers to spread across the ranks. Soldiers quietly speculated about who she was, why she was here, and how she had moved with such fluid precision. Some couldn't believe it, a woman performing at a level few men could reach. Others tried to rationalize it, telling themselves that perhaps the sergeant had misjudged, that it was luck, or that some trick had been used. But there would be no doubt soon. A group of senior officers arrived, walking briskly across the parade ground. Their expressions were serious, professional, yet tinged with recognition. They had been briefed about an unannounced evaluation exercise, and now, seeing the situation unfold, they understood the magnitude of what had happened. One officer, Colonel Harrington, stepped forward, clearing his throat to speak above the soft murmur of the formation. "Everyone, stand down," he said firmly. The crowd of soldiers slowly relaxed, their attention still focused on the woman. "There seems to be some confusion regarding the identity of this operator." He motioned toward the woman, who remained calm and composed, her posture relaxed but ready. "This is Lieutenant Commander Elena Rivera," he announced, his voice carrying across the parade ground. "An active-duty Navy SEAL. She has been temporarily assigned to evaluate inter-branch readiness. Her presence here is authorized, and her record is impeccable." A ripple of stunned reactions went through the formation. Soldiers who had been skeptical moments ago now felt a mixture of awe and humility. Private Jenkins whispered to his neighbor, barely able to process it, I told you. She's a SEAL." Colonel Harrington continued, explaining that Lieutenant Commander Rivera had undergone some of the most rigorous and classified training in the U.S. military. She had completed multiple deployments, including high-risk missions in hostile territories, and had earned commendations for her tactical expertise, leadership, and strategic acumen. Her credentials, previously hidden for security reasons, now stood revealed to the soldiers who had witnessed her in action. McAllister, still seated on the ground, slowly straightened, his pride bruised, but his respect undeniable. For the first time in decades, he faced someone whose skill could not be challenged, whose authority stemmed not from rank alone, but from years of training, discipline, and extraordinary performance. He looked at Lieutenant Commander Rivera, a mixture of acknowledgement and wonder on his face. "I underestimated you," he admitted, his voice low but sincere. "You are the real deal." She nodded slightly, not gloating, not seeking approval, simply acknowledging his statement. "It's not about underestimating or proving anything," she said calmly. "It's about being prepared and doing the job we're trained for. That's all." The soldiers absorbed her words, realizing that the morning's lesson extended far beyond combat skill. It was about respect earned through preparation, humility in the face of excellence, and the power of discipline over assumptions. The laughter and whispers that had filled the morning were gone, replaced by quiet reverence. Colonel Harrington concluded the briefing by reinforcing the importance of recognizing expertise regardless of gender, appearance, or preconceived notions. "What Lieutenant Commander Rivera has demonstrated is not just technical skill," he said, gesturing toward her. "It is professionalism, control, and the highest standard of military excellence. Let this moment remind you that training, preparation, and discipline are what truly define a soldier." The formation broke slightly, soldiers glancing at one another with newfound respect and a sense of humility. Even the youngest recruits understood that they had witnessed a rare and profound lesson, one that went far beyond the drills and routines of daily training. For Lieutenant Commander Rivera, the acknowledgement was quiet but complete. She had proven herself not with words, but with action, earning the respect of hundreds of soldiers in a way that no introduction, briefing, or paper credential ever could. And for the soldiers on that parade ground, the morning had become legend. Not a story of humiliation, nor of confrontation, but a story of excellence, mastery, and the unshakable truth that true skill demands respect. The tale of Lieutenant Commander Rivera would be retold on the base for years to come, inspiring every new recruit to understand that discipline, preparation, and quiet confidence are worth far more than authority alone. The sun had climbed high over Fort Bragg, but the morning's extraordinary events cast a shadow far larger than daylight could penetrate. 500 soldiers had witnessed something few could ever imagine. A single, composed woman standing toe-to-toe with one of the most respected sergeants on base, demonstrating skill, precision, and calm mastery that transcended rank, gender, and expectation. The parade ground, once filled with whispers, laughter, and anticipation, had transformed into a quiet testament to excellence. Soldiers stood in reflective silence, replaying the events in their minds. For many, it was difficult to reconcile what they had seen with the assumptions they had brought to the morning. The lesson was subtle but profound. Skill, preparation, and discipline speak louder than authority, and respect must be earned, not demanded. Private Jenkins, still wide-eyed, turned to his neighbor and whispered, "I don't think I'll ever forget today. Ever." His words captured the collective feeling of the formation. What they had witnessed wasn't just a display of elite training. It was a blueprint for professionalism, humility, and mastery. Sergeant McAllister, now assisted by medics, stood slowly, his pride bruised, but his respect genuine. He glanced at Lieutenant Commander Rivera, who stood calmly nearby, surveying the formation with her characteristic composure. "You've taught us all a lesson today," he admitted quietly, the words carrying more weight than any shout or command ever could. Not about skill alone, about respect, preparation, and control. "I won't forget it." Rivera nodded once, acknowledging the statement without a hint of arrogance. "It's not about proving anything," she said. "It's about being ready, about knowing your limits, and about executing your duty with discipline. That's the standard we should all strive for every day, in every situation." The soldiers absorbed her words, recognizing that the lesson extended far beyond the morning's drill. It wasn't about a single victory or a demonstration of strength. It was about mindset, professionalism, and the quiet power of preparation. They realized that true excellence didn't shout, it commanded attention through action, through consistency, and through unwavering dedication. As the formation began to break, conversations sparked quietly among the soldiers. Many discussed the importance of humility, the dangers of underestimating others, and the value of training to the highest standards. New recruits, in particular, were struck by the reality that assumptions based on appearances could be dangerously misleading. The story of what had just occurred would ripple through the base, repeated during evening drills, shared in bunkrooms, and referenced in briefings for years to come. Even officers who had initially questioned her presence found themselves reconsidering their assumptions. Lieutenant Commander Rivera's actions demonstrated that elite skill transcended traditional hierarchies, and that true authority comes not from title alone, but from competence, discipline, and execution under pressure. By the time the sun reached its zenith, the parade ground had returned to routine. Soldiers resumed drills and inspections, but the energy lingered, an invisible but palpable reminder of what had been demonstrated that morning. For those present, the lesson was permanent. They had witnessed an extraordinary display of mastery, and it had left an indelible mark on their understanding of professionalism, respect, and excellence. For Lieutenant Commander Rivera, the day concluded quietly. She had not sought recognition, applause, or glory. Her goal had always been simple: to complete her assignment with precision and professionalism. Yet through her actions, she had imparted a powerful lesson to hundreds of soldiers, one that would echo long after the drills ended. In the weeks and months that followed, the story of the morning's events became a quiet legend on the base. Recruits told it to one another, officers referenced it in discussions of training and readiness, and Sergeant McAllister himself, once skeptical and prideful, shared it as a lesson in humility and respect. The impact was lasting because it was not a story of force or dominance. It was a story of skill, discipline, and the quiet authority earned through preparation. The lesson lingered in every corner of the base, a reminder that appearances could be deceiving, that true mastery commands respect, and that the highest standard is achieved not through ego, But through excellence, and for the 500 soldiers who had witnessed it, that morning would never be forgotten. It had become more than a story. It had become a standard to aspire to, a measure of what it truly means to be elite, disciplined, and prepared for the unexpected.